Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to VHPD Housing Status Training Exiting Program Participants, a follow-up training for VHPD grantees concerning the reporting categories of exiting program participants. On behalf of the Veterans Homelessness Prevention Demonstration Project, I would like to thank you for joining us today. My name is John McGaugh, and I work at the National Center on Family Homelessness, part of AIR, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Today we will be featuring the following presenters: Justin Brock from HUD, Tracy Delano from Apt Associates, Karen de Blasio from HUD, Elizabeth Rudd from HUD, and Brian Fitzmaurice from HUD. Now, before we begin today's session, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's session will last approximately 60 minutes, and it is being recorded. A formal presentation followed by a question and answer period. If you have any unanswered questions, please contact your HUD desk officer. The webinar recording and PowerPoint presentation will be posted next week on the 1CPD Resource Exchange Training and Events page at the web address shown on your screen now. The Find By box can be used to filter the hundreds of training materials available. Next slide, please. Now, during the presentations today, participants will be in listen-only mode. For the final portion of the webinar, you are encouraged to ask questions, and phone lines of participants who indicate they would like to ask a question will be unmuted. To facilitate this process, please type in the phone number from which you are calling in the chat box now. You may also submit questions in the chat pod located on the left side of your screen. Those questions will be addressed at the conclusion of the formal presentations. Please feel free to submit questions at any point during today's presentation. And please listen to the presentation by using your telephone rather than your computer. While you are able to hear the discussion through computer speakers, they often provide feedback and make the discussion period more challenging, as you may have heard on other webinars. If you experience any other technical difficulties, please request assistance by using the chat pod. Next slide, please. And now, before we hand it over to our presenters, I'd like to just do a quick walkthrough of what they're going to cover. First, there'll be an overview of housing status by Justin Brock. Secondly, housing status complexities and reporting by Karen de Blasio and Tracy Delano. Followed by research and evaluation by Elizabeth Rudd. Ramping down will be covered by Brian Fitzmaurice. And finally, a question and answer period. And now I'd like to turn it over to Justin Brock from HUD to begin the presentation. Justin?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. First, we're going to do a quick review of the program exit form, as you can see on the slide there. Although most of you all are pretty familiar with this, I think, it'd still be good to review over the housing status categories as a way to add context to what we'll be discussing later in the webinar. So on the screen here, this is the first page of the program exit form, and the first arrow there points to the housing status, which I'll discuss in a moment. But while we're here, I'll also point out the reason for leaving, which is what the second arrow is pointing to. And then on the next screen is the last page of the exit form, and that arrow is pointing to the destination. And so the housing status, reason for leaving, and the destination are the three main categories that we're going to be focusing on today. And Karen and Tracy will be discussing the destination and reason for leaving in a little bit after I finish with the housing status categories. And so what I'm going to do now is just do a brief overview of the four main categories of the housing status subcategories, which are literally homeless, imminently losing their housing, unstably housed and at risk of losing housing, and stably housed. So literally homeless includes people at program entry or program exit who are in one of the following: places not designed for or ordinarily used as a regular sleeping accommodation for human beings, a shelter designed to provide temporary living arrangement, a hospital or other institution if the person was homeless immediately prior to entry into the hospital or institution, or fleeing a domestic violence situation. On the next slide, we have imminently losing their housing, and these would be persons who are currently housed but not literally homeless, imminently losing their housing, whether permanent or temporary, have no subsequent housing options identified, or lack the resources or support networks needed to retain their current housing situation. Some examples of imminent housing would include being evicted, being discharged from a hospital or other institution, or living in housing that has been condemned by housing officials and is no longer considered meant for human habitation. And then next we have unstably housed and at risk of losing their housing. These are persons that are currently housed and not literally homeless or imminently losing their housing. They're experiencing housing instability but have one or more other temporary housing options, or they may lack resources or support networks to retain or obtain their permanent. Housing instability may be evidenced by frequent moves because of economic reasons, living in the home of another because of economic hardship, being evicted, living in a hotel, living in severely overcrowded housing, being discharged from a hospital or other kind of institution, or otherwise living in housing that has characteristics associated with instability and an increased risk of homelessness. And so the last one is stably housed, which are persons in a stable housing situation and not at risk of losing this kind of housing. And so now we'll turn it over to Karen and Tracy. Karen?
Thanks, Justin. Good afternoon, everybody. So as John had said at the beginning, I'm Karen de Blasio. I'm a desk officer at the SNAPS office at HUD, and I worked on the Homelessness Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Program, the HPRP program here at HUD. So I'm here just to talk very quickly about some lessons that we learned during the HPRP program, specifically with the annual reports that communities did for HPRP, particularly around housing status and some of the challenges that communities had with this gathering this data. And two of the biggest issues that we had with housing status with this data element was first that we really found after the first year of the program, when we looked at the first year's worth of data, and we looked at housing status for the clients that had left the program, we really found some inconsistencies in how the data element was applied throughout each community. And so what I mean by this is Justin just explained and kind of went over the definition for all of the different components of housing status, literally homeless, imminently at risk, unstably housed, or stably housed. It's important to know the definitions of those different components, but it's also important to make sure that these definitions and this data element is being used consistently and applied consistently across your community, across all of the case managers that are entering data and meeting with clients. So it's really important, and Tracy will go into this a little bit more, and she'll provide some examples so you get kind of a better flavor of what we're talking about here. But again, it's not just enough to say, well, here's the housing status at exit. We need you to collect housing status at exit, and here's the definitions. There really needs to be some conversations and make sure in your community to make sure that everybody is on the same page and they understand, in a particular situation, what should the housing status be, when the person exits if this is their situation. Because the reality of it is what we're really looking for this to reflect is the condition of housing after VHP assistance is received when that person is exiting the program. So we understand that it may be one-time assistance. We know some of these clients come, they get assistance one time, and they exit the same day or very shortly after. It's very short-term assistance, and that's okay. But we really need you to record where that person is going or what their housing status is that day when they exit. So it's essentially where are they going that night. And again, we'll have some concrete examples so you'll get a better understanding. But again, it's really important. The other thing that we found in HPRP was that it seemed like people were really hesitant because somebody was leaving the program. They were really hesitant to mark possibly that they were unstably housed. Or that they were at risk of losing their housing. And, we need to make sure that if that is the case, and if that's, that's kind of that the case manager has some discretion, but if that is the case as to, how, where that person is when they're leaving the program, when they're exiting, we need it to be recorded as such. Marking somebody is leaving, having that housing status at exit is not necessarily, a ding against the program. We're not looking for everybody to be stably housed. We also, as Justin, when he went over the exit form, you saw that there are also destination at exit and reason for leaving the program. So we have a couple of different pieces that we can look at to try to help understand your client's stories and what the situation was when they left the program and help us determine outcomes. But it's really important that housing status is applied, again, consistently, and that case managers understand how to apply these different pieces of housing status to different scenarios at exit, and that really, the information is accurately recorded when the client exits the program. So what I'd like to do now is hand it over to Tracy. She's going to talk a little bit more about this, and she'll also provide those examples that I was just referencing.
Great. Thanks so much, Karen. So how did this get so complicated? And why do we ask all these questions? Well, I've got this echo, guys. Is there a way to fix that?
If you mute your computer speakers, Tracy.
Sorry, guys. Volume control. I'm getting there. I'm not technical savvy here, so hold on one sec. Okay. Oh, good, it's working. Okay, so why did we get here? Why is it so complicated? Why do we ask all these questions? And many of you already know. You've been here from the beginning and you know where all these questions came from. They're really based on the 2010 HMIS data standards. And you're really collecting all the data you need to run the VHPD APR, which is sort of a combination of the old HPRP APR and the COC APR. And so you're really collecting all this information based upon the old data standards. And at the beginning of the program, or the demonstration program, you all should have received this data collection protocols for VHPD. And the data collection protocols really literally goes through every question and talks about when do you collect the information, who do you collect the information on, why do you collect this information, and all the definitions. So always go back to that if you have particular questions, and I'm sure that Brian or Justin can go ahead and send that back out to you in case you've misplaced it. But let's today focus on housing status and the complexities around housing status. And also just a reminder to make sure that you review your data every month, that you complete missing information. Take a look at those reasons and destinations for leaving to help you determine what the housing status should be. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide and talk about keys to helping us determining housing status. So obviously if someone's on the streets or they're in shelters and they're literally homeless, and conversely if they're in permanent supportive housing or they've gotten into the Voucher program or they're in shelter plus care, or they're living permanently with family or friends, they're stably housed. So those ones are pretty easy. I think where it gets a little messy is those two in-between categories. The one about whether someone's imminently going to be homeless or whether they're unstably housed and at risk of homelessness. And it is confusing because a lot of the examples are similar between whether they're unstably housed or whether they're imminently at risk of homelessness. So first things first, always think from the case management's perspective, what do you anticipate their housing stability is going to be for this household? Think about things like, do they have a steady income? Do they have family or community supports to help them? Do they have a steady job? Do they have access to monthly benefits? Or can you anticipate, based upon their current situation and some of these other factors, are they likely to really imminently become homeless again? Or are they kind of not really greatly housed, but they're not going to become homeless tomorrow? So, and the other factors obviously you're looking for is a reason for leaving. So why is the household exiting the program? Did they simply run out of time? Did they disappear? Were they non-compliant with the program, which might lead you to think they might be having difficulties? And where are they going after they leave the program? Again, anticipate housing stability. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some case samples, and you're going to have a chance to sort of do some polling and vote on what you think the best answer is going to be. So let's go to the next slide and talk about case example number 1, the Smith family. So Mr. and Smith are married. They have 2 young children, and upon exit from the VHPD program, the Smith family are exiting because simply they're just reached their maximum amount of time in the program. They're unfortunately still living in an area motel. They're paying a week-to-week rate at the motel. Mr. Smith, he's a roofer, and sometimes he gets paid, and sometimes he goes to get paid, and the people who are supposed to pay him have disappeared, and sometimes during the week he just can't find work that week. They're really not sure where they would stay if Mr. Smith doesn't bring in that weekly money, and there really aren't any extended family members living anywhere near them that they could back up to help request assistance from or to stay with. So in this particular case example, on the left-hand side, we're going to have a poll question, and I'm going to wait here for the poll question to come up. So if you look at your screen, it's coming here. On the left-hand side is the question. And the question is, what do you think is the housing status of the Smith family upon exit? So it looks like we've got a lot of different answers, with about most of you coming in at imminently losing their housing, a few unstably housed, and one client doesn't know. I'm going to give it just a little bit more. Time. So look at all these different opinions. So again, think in the back of your mind as a case manager looking at this family. Do you think that they're literally homeless? Are they imminently losing their housing, or are they unstably housed at risk of losing their housing based upon the information in the case example? Okay, we're about 50-50 between imminently losing their housing and unstably housed. So how do we broadcast the results? Do people just see it as it pops up? Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the answer and see what, if I was the case manager, what I think I would put down for the family. So the next slide. Can we get to the next slide? Hello? I don't think I lost internet.
Tracy, are you trying to get to the answer? We have that up, I believe.
Oh, okay. For some reason, it wasn't showing on my screen. And it should be, not this one. Shoot, let's go back to case example 1, answer.
Yeah,
Yes.
we can see it.
You can see it?
Yeah.
So it's just, okay, good. All right, so the answer for this one, if I was the case manager for the Smith family, is that they are, I would think that these folks are probably pretty close to imminently losing their housing. And the reason that I went with that is there's no steady income, there's no family support, they're living in a hotel or motel that they're paying for. So they're not literally homeless. because they're paying for housing in a motel. Now, if the emergency shelter, like a faith-based organization or the government was paying for their housing in a motel or hotel, then they could maybe be considered literally homeless. But if they're paying for it on their own, they're not considered homeless. They're unstably housed, they're at risk of losing their housing, but they're really much more close to losing their housing because he's not getting paid on a regular basis and they don't have anybody to fall back on. So in this particular instance, I, as the case manager, would have checked that they were imminently losing their housing. So let's go to the next question and see if we can see and compare the differences. So the next case example is the Johnson family, and Mrs. Johnson has one child, age 9, and upon exit from the program, Mrs. Johnson is exiting because she's completed the program. Now, she had a history of frequent moves between apartments and family and friends, but she was able, through the assistance, to get a front desk job at a local hotel. She is living in a local motel, but she's saved up enough money for a deposit and just needs to save a little bit more to cover utilities, and she can stay with her parents temporarily if necessary. So let's see what you all think here. Oh, look at that. 100% really believe that she's unstably housed. She's at risk of losing her housing because she's living in a hotel or motel, but she's not going to lose her housing tomorrow. So that's pretty good. Let's go ahead and move to what I would have done as a case manager for the answer on this one. So the case manager can anticipate that the Johnson family is maybe unstably housed, but they're not really at imminent risk of losing their housing. She's got a lot of stuff going for her, right? You know, she's saving some money. She needs to save just a little bit more. She's got supports and services behind her. So in this particular instance, I would say she's not really stably housed because she's still living in a hotel motel from week to week, but she's close. So she's unstably housed, she's at risk for losing her housing, but she's not going to lose her housing tomorrow. All right, let's go on to the next case example, the last one. And this is Mr. Jackson. Mr. Jackson has PTSD. He has a history of substance abuse. And upon program exit, Mr. Jackson is exiting because he's been in the program to the maximum time allowed by the program. However, Mr. Jackson has a voucher, but he has not yet located a housing unit. He's living in an area motel paid for by a local charitable organization, but he is also receiving VA disability benefits. And in fact, he's working with the VA, who has a case manager assigned to him to find a suitable housing unit. He's receiving treatment, supportive services provided through the local VA. So here, this one's kind of hard because, you know, here we're saying he's living in the motel paid for by a local charitable organization. However, we need to go back to what the case manager thinks about how stable this person is. One, he's already got the VASH voucher. He hasn't located the housing unit, but he does have the VASH voucher. He does have income, and he has help finding that unit. So we've got some folks who are pulling in on that motel paid for by the local charitable organization. But while you're thinking about it, I want you to think about the case manager anticipation of housing stability upon exit for the program. Okay, so let's go to what I would have done as a case manager, and hopefully these examples will help you figure out what to do. So in this instance, the anticipated housing stability for Mr. Jackson is actually stable. He's got a voucher, he's got a case manager, he's got income. He hasn't moved into the housing yet, but you know he's got a case manager who's driving him around and looking for housing. So what I would do in this instance is I would actually mark them as stably housed. And then I would follow up with the VA within a couple of weeks to verify that he actually did move into the housing. If he didn't, if he disappeared or something fell through, you can always change the housing status back to where he is now. But in this instance, he's been accepted into the VASH program. He's actually got the voucher. He's just on the streets looking for the voucher. Okay, so wow, a lot of different opinions there. What we're going to do now is move on to our next presenter, who's Elizabeth Rudd, and she's going to really review with you the importance of evaluation and research.
Thank you, Tracy. This is Elizabeth Rudd, and I work in the Program Evaluation Division at HUD, and I manage the research contracts for the evaluation of the VHPD. So the interim report on the VHPD evaluation had some concerns about data consistency. It noted that some of the differences across sites in housing status for the, I think both at entry and exit, seemed to be too big to reflect actual differences, and so the report raised concern that the differences might reflect different ways of applying the categories. They also noted some possible problems with software not accurately taking in or somehow screwing up what people had entered and not grabbing the right data. And finally, the bigger context here is that a report on the Homelessness Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Program criticized HUD for not having a good measure of outcomes because the housing status categories in that program were not used in the same way everywhere, as Karen mentioned earlier. And this is really why using the definitions of housing status in the same way matters so much for research and evaluation. It matters because we all want to know if the VHPD helps people avoid homelessness and become stably housed. And the data collected by the programs and reported in the APR reports are the only data that we have for all VHPD clients that can tell us what kind of housing situation they were in before the program and what kind of housing situation they were in after the program. This is actually our only universal measure of the impact of the program on housing status, and this is the outcome that matters most. So regarding these categories, for research and evaluation purposes, it is more important that everybody apply categories in the same way than it is that the definitions are the very best possible definitions. We can debate forever about where exactly to draw the lines between different categories, but what matters for measurement is that we agree to draw the lines in the same way now and in the future, and hopefully in the past. If we have the same measure over time, then we can, in fact, observe changes over time. But if the categories are applied differently over time, then we don't know if we are observing a change in people or a change in how people are categorized. And if we have the same measure in two different sites, then we can observe differences between the sites. But if the categories are applied differently in different sites, then we don't know if there are differences in veteran outcomes or if there are just different ways of categorizing veteran outcomes. Now, this is true for all social research, but for the evaluation of the VHPD and programs like it, it's especially important because there's more at stake than just knowing the truth about VHPD. The evaluation reports and the APR data become the official true story about what happened. And this story lives on, and it may influence policy and funding decisions for years to come. So we want to get it right so that we can influence policy and funding in a way that does tend to shift over time, funding into programs and activities that contribute to preventing and ending homelessness. So that's why all this is so incredibly important. And now I can hand it over to Brian for wrapping up, I think, or...
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. I just wanted to take a few minutes to wrap up and to reinforce the importance of accurate and consistent data being collected and reporting, but to move on, not in this webinar per se, but what we're going to be coming to soon, and plant the seed to start the discussion of transition and what we call ramping down for the pending conclusion of the VHPD demo grant terms, which will come in the February-March 2014 timeframe. As it's been said, as Elizabeth and others were emphasizing, is that it's important that we all be on the same page, the same understanding when we're reporting the data. as we start to roll out our guidance to everyone, to the grantees, we're going to look to our own experience with the HPRP program, and we're so glad that Karen was able to join us for this webinar. And if you were involved at all with the HPRP program, hopefully you might have participated or listened to the webinars that the HPRP folks did in 2011. We will be looking to their experience as we start rolling out guidance for this program, because even though this is a tiny slice of the $1.5 billion HPRP had, it's very similar in what we will be seeing is because it has a finite endpoint. So it has a lot of, obviously we built VHPD on the HPRP program, so we're going to be looking to that experience and how we can help people, our grantees, transition to, as we close out in the coming months. And we don't want to get people too focused on the end because we're working hard right now, but we want to create and provide as much assistance as we can so it's a smooth transition. Just a few, at a high level, a few key topics that we would be including in this discussion. Of course, there's many more, but here's a few just to kind of get your thoughts going on this, to review the current budgets, your current budgets, and determine whether or not funds need to be shifted in your current budget. That's a possibility. To project how much your grants, how much you are spending per household, for example, on a weekly and monthly basis, and to determine the amount of funds that will be needed through the remainder of the grant term. We'd be looking at helping you determine what is the average length of participation. This will be very important as you gauge when, based on your grant and the characteristics of the people you are serving, at what point you need to stop bringing new people on, because obviously that will be very critical as we get toward the end of this calendar year. Also, looking at the grant agreement that each of the 5 sites have, Article 6, which is project closeout. It mentions some very definite forms in the closeout stage, really at the end. Of course, we'll help everyone understand what those requirements are. Also, to help develop a plan to transition at the end. So we would be moving from bringing folks onto this program to referring folks to other programs, quite possibly other VA programs. As always, we want you to provide any questions you have that might not be answered in our session today to your HUD desk officer here. Also, to let you know that starting with our August monthly call, which will be approximately 2 weeks from yesterday on August 19th, we'll start using our monthly calls to start, really get this discussion going on transitioning and ramping down. Of course, we will also have webinars coming up dedicated, solely to the transition phase. So we want to get everyone start to think about that. And certainly, please start sharing the questions you have with your desk officer so we can see if there's, a lot of them are typical questions, but there might be some unique ones that you have that we want to know about so we can, help you in that process. Okay, so now I think we have plenty of time for questions. I want to turn it back to John, who is our moderator, to remind folks how you can submit questions and participate in the question period.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Yes, we are going to move on to the discussion portion of the webcast, as Brian just mentioned. And once again, your phone lines will be unmuted to encourage discussion, and we'll unmute those who raise their hands, but you need to type in the phone number you're calling from, as some of you already have. If you've done it once, you're all set, and if you have a question and you haven't yet, please type in your number so we can know which line to unmute. There is a raise your hand function in the Adobe Connect room, which we're all in, that we will use to organize this discussion. It's located in the top of your screen to the far left, maybe a couple of icons in from the left, but on the upper left side. you'll see a figure of a person raising his or her hand. By clicking on this symbol, it notifies the presenters that you'd like to speak.
Okay, I'll do the bumming.
So if we could practice real quick right now, if everyone could please raise your hand by clicking on that icon to make sure you can find it. I see a bunch of hands going up. Awesome. And if you could all put your hands down now, again by clicking on the same symbol. Oh, that's good. Let's do it again. No, that's okay. Okay, I think we have that. So if you prefer to stay muted, you may also submit questions or participate in the discussion by using the chat pod on the left side of the screen, and we'll funnel those questions to our presenters for answers. So let's start. Is there a question to start on the phone line? In the meantime, we have a question from Lois, and I'm going to read this to our presenters to field as whoever is most appropriate. Lois writes, relating to housing status at entry, what program, rapid rehousing or eviction prevention, does a household whose head of household is literally homeless and the remainder of the household is at risk? Relating to a housing status at entry, what program does a household whose head of household is literally homeless and the remainder of the household is at risk? I'm looking for the rest of that question. Lois, could you type in the remainder of that question? Unless I'm missing something. I think there's a final part to that question. I see you're typing. And if one of our presenters could be ready to field this for Lois. And she writes, which program do they fall into? Is it split, or do they follow the HOHH, head of household?
Well, we'll take a shot here. This is Brian with Justin and Elizabeth, and Karen, please chime in as you need to. If we should be focusing on the head of the household if that's the qualifying veteran. If that person is presenting to the program as literally homeless, we would want to be employing rapid rehousing. Now, Lois, it sounds like there has not yet been a family reunification. So, for example, other members of the household, the children presumably are doubled up, at risk. So it sounds like what you're talking about is a matter of family reunification. The idea, the objective is to get the other members of the household back together. But if we should be keying on the qualifying head of household, the veteran. If they're literally homeless as they present to the program, what we're going to be looking at is a rapid rehousing intervention. Does Justin, Elizabeth, that right? Yeah. I mean, if there's some other facts there, Lois, let us know. But hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you, Lois. Again, if there are other questions that people want to ask verbally, raise your hand, and we'll call on you. Here's another question around the housing status for a veteran who, in Tracy's example, had a VASH voucher, a HUD VASH voucher assigned, but he had not moved in. If he had not moved in, is working with a case manager, but needs a deposit of first month's rent and does not have that money available yet, would that affect housing status?
That's an excellent question, and my initial reaction to that would be no, because the VA's responsibility is to help find the resources that individual needs in order to move into the housing, and there are some resources out there. And so again, I would just caution that the case manager needs to follow up with the VA within a couple of weeks just to make sure that they were able to figure out those hurdles and get the client moved into housing. And again, you can always change that housing back to something else if for some reason the housing fell through and he wasn't able to move in. But the key here is he's received the voucher.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tracy. I see we have a question being typed by CNY Veterans Outreach Center. Nope, stop typing. Typing again. And again, please raise your hand if you have a question you want to ask verbally. And we have a question coming in, just waiting for it to finish. No pressure.
Nice, good filling in the space there, John.
Yeah, thanks. And here it is from CNY Veterans Outreach Center. The question is, after 2 weeks in the VHPD program, a veteran ended up in jail, and we do not have a release time. At exit, what is his situation? Good question.
Well, I'll let Karen correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but while it might not be the most desirable situation, in that instance, he's stably housed. It's not homeless. What do you think, Karen?
No, I agree. I was trying to think about what we told people because we got that exact question in HPRP, and I believe that we did tell them to, that they could exit them because it is a stable situation. It may not be optimal, but it's stable.
I'm sorry, this is Elizabeth. That seems to contradict the instructions that said the housing status depends on what they were before they entered the institution. So if they were literally homeless before they went to the mental hospital or the jail, then they're literally homeless. Because when they come out, that is how they would be categorized.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking, this is Brian, also thinking about literally the way that the question is posed. I guess we don't know all the circumstances yet, but, if this is a short-term jail stay, I mean, jail versus something
Prison,
long-term like prison, if this is something that might be, a couple weeks, maybe a month or two, where they have the possibility of coming back, we have to look at that as well. Sacco, up in New York, I don't know if that's the situation you have that you posed, but if it's less than 90 days, that makes a big difference, obviously. So.
And in this case, they write in it was 10 to 15-year sentence.
Oh, okay. Well, he's not going to be back by the end of the demo, so.
Right, the program will be over by the time you get
Okay.
back.
Well, that.
Yeah, and I would recommend, Karen and Justin, that we sort of might want to come back to that one after we've, because it's a good question.
Yeah.
And there is an issue of time and how much is too much time. And there's also the sort of the ground rules that have been set for when we do data collection for point in time count. So we might want to internally talk about it and then put out a final response.
Yeah, I think we should do that, and I would defer to Tracy and Karen to make it most consistent with earlier data collection, but at the same time, just reading the instructions, it's totally unclear that someone in prison would be categorized as stably housed.
The prison would count as an institution, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So then, according to the definition of literally homeless, if they were in a shelter or if they were homeless prior to entering an institution, then when they get out, in theory, they would still be considered homeless, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, let's review and then send out a note.
Yeah.
Okay, well, great. Thanks for posing that, CNY Veterans Outreach Center. I want to remind folks we do have a few more minutes left, so this is a great opportunity to ask folks at HUD and Tracy at APT any questions like that might be nuanced and complex. This is a great opportunity to put your questions forward. And to the presenters, as we're waiting for a question, I know there's some great question that's going to come in a moment. Are there any nuanced complexities like the one we just described that you've seen in the past that would be helpful to describe that you've come across?
Karen, do you have any HPRP examples that you could throw out?
I guess the only example, and I talked about this when we were reviewing for the webinar the other day, and it has more to do with housing status at entry, but we found one of the inconsistencies that I was talking about that we found across the board was we found a lot of communities, when we looked at their first-year report, a lot of them were entering people into the program with the housing status of stably housed. And when we called them up to ask them, why that was and what was the situation for a lot of these clients, a lot of them had, VASH vouchers. And so they were thinking, well, because they have they're here from me and just getting a security deposit from me, so therefore they're stably housed because they have the VASH voucher. Now, as Tracy said, when you're exiting and you have that voucher in your hand and you're exiting with that voucher, yes, you're stably housed. But in the case of HPRP, these people were using HPRP for security deposit and like first month's rent, which you can't pay with VASH. So we had to explain, and again, this is more of a, make sure that everybody understands how these things need to be applied, and make sure that they're all applying them consistently and correctly, because the reality of it was that person sitting there with a VASH voucher looking for a security deposit at entrance into the program was not yet stably housed. They were at risk or, whatever their current situation was the day they entered the program. Now, when they exited, they could have exited 3 days later once they found a unit, and they had that VASH voucher, and they had, then they were stably housed. But as far as I think our biggest issue with exit, housing status at exit for HPRP, again, was just the consistency. I think the people went to trainings, they understood, the reporting, but they didn't kind of take that extra step and in the communities talk about some of these tricky situations like the prison, if somebody's going to, entering into or left the program to go to prison for 10 years. Didn't talk about these particular situations, and, in many cases, just like on the phone here, you asked all of us, and 2 of us had one answer, and a couple of us had a different answer. So it's important to kind of sort through those things, and as Elizabeth said, make sure that, you can debate it all day long, but just make sure that there's one way that you're consistently applying those housing statuses so that the data is valid and reliable when we look at it, across your community.
That's a great point. Thanks for sharing that. We have another question from Veronica E. And Veronica, your phone line is unmuted, so ask away.
Thanks. My question was just concerning the data consistency that we kind of talked about as a problem with VHPD and in the past with HPRP. But with going back and trying to look at follow-up for the example that was given with the veteran that had the VASH voucher and was considered stably housed, I'm just wondering how feasible that would actually be for a case manager at one of the subgrantees to do a follow-up when they actually been discharged from VHPD at that point, and what impact that would have on the data if, let's say, we didn't get to do the follow-up, and oftentimes people do have vouchers but don't often utilize them sometimes for various reasons.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent question. I'm assuming that in your community, you've probably developed a fairly close relationship with the VA administration, and you're knowing, that this person's being handed off into the VASH program. Unlike someone who disappears and it's hard to find them and hard to figure out where they went, if someone's entering into a program in your community, hopefully the case manager has a relationship with the case managers over at the VA and can fairly easily follow up with the care workers over there to make sure that that client, in fact, did get into housing. And, I would just make it as a note, a tickler on your calendar or something like that to remind you to follow up to verify that the housing status is in fact stable.
Yeah, and I think here in San Diego we do have a close relationship with the VA and the subgrantees and the grantee that works out really well for us. I think we just have such a high volume of veterans being served by our program right now that I see it being very difficult to kind of maintain that that type of data collection and follow-up.
Sure, yeah.
Mhm.
they have different circumstances that always pop up, and then to go back and to change the data as the situation changes, it seems a little bit difficult just for trying to keep consistent data for the program. Because I initially would present that as the situation at closing as opposed to what may happen in the next few weeks.
Tracy?
Yeah, and I think the issue here is consistency. So, I mean, as I said, if I was the case manager, that's what I would have done, because I would have considered the client to be stably housed, because I knew that they had a VASH voucher and the help they needed to move into the housing. But again, I think what we're talking here is trying to be consistent, and Elizabeth, I don't know if you have other recommendations. As long as they're consistently applying it across the grant, that does seem to be the important piece.
Well, it would be great if it was across all the sites consistently, so I don't know if maybe we want to regroup and write a note about this one as well. I mean, it sounds like in San Diego it would be too hard to actually do the follow-up consistently, so it needs to be done by the judgment of the case manager right at the moment when they leave. So then maybe we're going to have to do that for all of them, and that might put a slightly different spin on some of those cases.
Okay, well, we may have one more question. We're just checking. Looked like someone had their hand. We do have time for one more. If anyone has a burning question, we're going to check if that one is, in fact, a question.
This is Marty Burt, and I think I just got my line unmuted. Is that true?
That's true.
Oh, good. Then I definitely have questions.
All right.
Okay, I'll just raise them since we don't have that much time. My understanding from the grantee meeting and what was said there was that people have been told at the beginning of the program to do housing status as of the day of program exit. And everything that Tracy said in terms of how to think about this implies a more of a future orientation. And there was also discussion at the grantee meeting about people, like for instance, income at exit. People knowing that people had just gotten a job, and so they would have been on the job for a week. And if you reported that as their income last 30 days, it would look like they didn't have enough money to sustain it. And if you, but if you went out to 1 month post, they would have been working for that month, and it would look much clearer. So I think that this time frame business, which Veronica also just basically raised, is one that really has to get focused on, because one issue is the work it is for the program, but another really serious issue from an evaluation perspective or a HUD perspective is we don't know what any of this stuff means if we're using different time frames. And everything that you talked about today in terms of the examples implies that you're supposed to be thinking about something beyond the moment of program exit. So that's one thing that really concerns me. Another thing that concerns me as you talked was that the way this is presented, the way the variable is presented, you have literally homeless, imminently at risk, unstably housed, and then stably housed. But it seems to me there's drastic confusion about which is more serious among the middle two. Because the imminently losing your housing could be, and often is, people who have been primary tenants and they're facing eviction, but it could be the first time that they're facing eviction. And in some ways they are more stable than the situation that you described in the motel, where the person is, where the household has already lost housing and is just sort of trying to cope. So I'm very concerned about the consistency of use, and I'm not sure that the webinar has solved it. But maybe some future guidance can solve it. Calling somebody stably housed when they've gone to jail it's just not the meaning of stably housed that I know you may have to do it, but it just really floors me. And that's from an evaluator perspective.
Point taken, Marty. Thank you. Clearly, we still have questions to address. I mean, that's a very good point. And I mean, we can start. Please, as these questions, we want to continue this conversation. Obviously, we have our monthly calls, but we want to help everyone to get these right. So, if more questions are raised in this call, that's okay, because we want to make sure we're all on the same page as well.
Great, and I think that's a good place to wrap it up, Brian and all, as we're just about out of time. I'd like to say a few things in closing. First of all, thank you everyone who posed questions for the panel today and enriched the discussion. Thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar, and thanks particularly to Justin, Karen, Tracy, Elizabeth, and Brian for today's presentation. Based on the content covered today by our presenters, we should now be able to do three things: fully understand the 6 housing status categories and their definitions, examine unique circumstances for a wide range of exiting program participants and how they fit into each of the exit-related categories, and lastly, understand how the housing status of program participants relates to research and evaluation. Next slide, please. As a reminder, if you have additional questions, please refer them to your HUD desk officer. This webinar recording and PowerPoint presentation, again, will be posted shortly, within a week, on the 1CPD Resource Exchange Training and Events page. And you can obtain information or assistance from the 1CPD Resource Exchange by searching the resource library, by checking out 1CPD News, or again, contacting your HUD desk officer, or requesting technical assistance. So thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.